privilege to welcome back Dr. E. Michael Jones. He's editor of Culture Wars magazine and a prolific author of titles, including The Slaughter of Cities, Urban Renewal as Ethnic Cleansing, The Catholic Church and the Cultural Revolution, Barren Metal, A History of Capitalism as the Conflict Between Labour and Usury, and John Cardinal Kroll and the Cultural Revolution, which I believe is back in print at the moment. His website can be found at culturewars.com, and there you can find information to subscribe to Culture Wars magazine, which I would recommend. Dr. Jones, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Theo. Good to be back.
Well, thanks very much for coming back on. It was very interesting talking to you last time about the New Right and the neoconservative movement, how it co-opted the spirit of counter-revolution to the social changes of the 1960s, redirected them, and sort of re-established the money power and sort of the all-encompassing power of usury. And I thought, seeing as it's 50 years since the famous Événement of 1968, May 1968 in Paris, and simultaneous cultural revolutions across the West, it would be well timed to talk about the same sort of process that happened on the left. So this is the 68 revolution, what that represents. We're in many ways living under that revolution right now, and I wanted to talk about how we came to a position whereby nowadays in the Western world, leftist parties are absolutely fixated talking about whether it's transgender bathrooms or gay marriage, but you can't talk about debt bondage or the suppression of wages via immigration. And I know, Dr. Jones, you're an expert on these cultural and political trends. What relation does this trend have to Michel Foucault?
Well, you're right. It's the 50th anniversary of the revolution in France in 1968 that almost toppled the government. Before I get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about South Bend, Indiana.
Sure.
There was a resurrection of ethnic consciousness and Irish music here, beginning around to the year 2000. And I played Irish music in a pub here for about 16 years. And the leader of this renaissance was a hippie from who was at Notre Dame at this period of time during the period of revolutionary change, and he died in the beginning of this year. So we went to a memorial, and there he was. They're flashing pictures up there of this man, and suddenly there's a picture of him standing there next to a sign that says, "I stand with Planned Parenthood."
Right.
And it just kind of summarized the whole stupidity of the left in the United States of America. What do you mean you stand by Planned Parenthood? Why is that being left wing? This guy his son described him. He asked at the memorial. His son asked him at one point, "What's this political stuff mean? What does all this left-right stuff mean? And where do you stand?" And he said, "I'm to the left of Stalin." Well, no, you're not. No, you're not, because you were basically a boat floating on the same river that everyone else has been floating on for the past 50 years. And over that period of time, everything got changed. So there was a moment with the revival of Irish music when I thought we were all going to go back to a previous era, let's say the 1930s, because that's been in the air here in the United States. Trump channeled this feeling when he talked about America First, and that's how he got elected.
Yep.
And America First was the Midwest reaction against the Wall Street bankers, and it was an attempt to keep America out of World War II and build up the manufacturing manufacturing base, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, that was all. So the 1930s was also the era of the worker song. And so we had songs like Joe Hill, the Ballad of Joe Hill, where working men defend their rights. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. And I thought, I can sing that song with conviction. I'm not a hippie anymore, but I can sing that song. And I tried to sing that song with conviction. But it was a little bit like Joan Baez at Woodstock.
Right.
Joan Baez sang the Ballad of Joe Hill at Woodstock, and it was like completely out of place. Something had changed. Woodstock was 1 year after 1968. And 1968 was the revolution that almost happened in France. It was also the beginning of the New Left, which is a term that David Horowitz was using out at Berkeley, where he and a lot of other Jewish revolutionaries had taken up residence in the mid-60s. There was a magazine called Ramparts, was originally a Catholic magazine, which talked about social justice issues. But over this period of time, the whole terminology of what revolution meant got changed. So to go back to France in 1968, this is the revolutionary movement did not disappear at this point. They almost succeeded, and they felt strengthened, and now it's going to sweep throughout Europe. So it was originally an anti-Vietnam War movement, which is what it was in Germany. The young people of my generation, were all united in opposition against the war, and that started spreading. And in Germany, for example, you had this simultaneous phenomenon of basically the people of my generation all hate America's involvement in Vietnam, but they all love the anti-war movement. And so they immediately adopt all of the paraphernalia of the anti-war movement, including blue jeans and all this other type of stuff. So that when I arrived in Germany in 1973 to teach English, I was immediately a cultural hero because I had long hair and wore blue jeans. And that was the symbol of protest. Yeah. And that's what it was like. But the left in France, they had a Maoist group called Gauche Prolétarien, run by some Jewish guy. And they were swept along on this movement too. And at this point, the revolution, the left is being swept closer and closer to terrorism. The repression is starting to fall down on the movement. They're getting more and more violent. At this point in Germany, you've got a guy like Joschka Fischer, who became foreign minister, who was involved in beating up cops, kicking them in the head during a protest that got increasingly violent. And so at a certain point, the left in France couldn't make that final move into terrorism. But the Baader-Meinfhoff gang in Germany did. And so at this point, the leadership of the revolutionary movement shifted to Germany. And you had a series of increasingly violent incidents, largely in Germany. They started by burning down department stores. Kaufhof got set on fire in Berlin. And then it fell into the hands of basically a psychopath by the name of Andreas Baader, complete psychopath, who had no sense of right or wrong or whatever. And Ulrike Meinhof, who was a respected journalist at the time, joined the movement out of disillusionment. Something had to be done, and the people at Concrete, the magazine she wrote for, weren't doing it. So there's a famous scene where she basically jumps out the window and joins the revolutionary movement. This is all, by the way, in a film, feature-length film called the Baader-Meinhoff Effect.
I've seen that film. Yeah, it's a good film.
Yeah, it's a good film about what was going on. So you have some sense of what's going on here, and it all kind of reached a crisis around 1975. 1975. The first response of the German government was to allow the introduction of pornography into German culture. It was very specific, a specific kind of pornography, very ethnic pornography. So a lot of it, the first one was a film called Las Jugendkumpel, which was based on a novel that had been written. It's about the Ruhrgebiet, about the steel coal industry. And the story is basically a guy, you begin by seeing all this picture of all the, the steel mills and the Ruhr. This is a worker, he's going to work, and he's kind of talking to himself about, I think I'm going to go to East Germany because the worker is treated better in East Germany. Then he goes to the local Kneipe, to the pub he usually goes to, and the guy who runs the pub starts talking to him and says, nah, forget about that. And he takes him to a whorehouse. And at that point, you have a lot of skin, a lot of TNA, and that's the end of his desire to go to Germany. Well, this is, in a nutshell, what all of these movies were supposed to create. They took a survey, the government took a survey right around the time I was there, and they found that 60% of all the people of my generation would have put up a member of the Baader-Meinfhoff gang overnight in their apartment if they were asked. So there's a huge amount of sympathy for this revolutionary movement. It was a protest against the American conquest of Germany. It was a protest against the social engineering that had been imposed on Germany, because in America, it was a protest against the social engineering that had been imposed on my generation in the United States. Nobody knew the exact details, but they knew that something was wrong, and they knew that Berkeley, the places like Berkeley, were getting funding for defense projects, defense research, and they didn't like it, and they were being pushed in a direction that they did not like. So this is the protest movement. It's focused on Vietnam, and it's a worldwide movement now. And in Germany, it's a threat to the existence of the government. There's no question about it. The government almost fell because of the Baader-Meinhoff gang, because they simply couldn't get it done. So the first response is pornography, because that gets you to turn inward. And it turns out that they used it elsewhere as well. Portugal, 1974, the Salazar died, and the communists attempted to take over Portugal. And Frank Carlucci, who was in the CIA, who had been in the Congo fighting, trying to get Che Guevara, who was fighting in the Congo at that time. Frank Carlucci goes to Portugal, and he floods the country with pornography. This is in Time magazine, which is, by the way, the propaganda ministry of the United States of America at this time. There's no question about it. Okay, Time Life and the CIA were basically two concentric circles. C.D. Jackson was the guy who linked the Time Life and the CIA. So this Time magazine says, some people, kind of being cutesy, the way the Time style is, some people even say the CIA was involved. Well, the CIA was involved in flooding Portugal with pornography, and the German equivalent, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, was involved, or simply allowing this to happen in Germany as well. So we come to the crucial turning point is 1975. And as you mentioned, the crucial figure is Michel Foucault, because the French at this time were the philosophers of the Western world. And France had a huge influence on thought at this period of time, largely because of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus in World War II. Existentialism was kind of the philosophy of the 1950s, also in America. And it was basically a defeatist philosophy of people who basically couldn't stop the Germans from taking over their country. Yeah. So Michel Foucault comes to the attention of the oligarchs who run our educational system, and he gets invited to Berkeley. Michel Foucault is a disciple of Nietzsche and Georges Bataille. He's got that type of anti-logos pedigree. He calls himself a philosopher, but he hates everything about logos and the roots of Western philosophy. In that sense, he's exactly like Nietzsche, who felt that Socrates was the great villain in human history. Goes to Berkeley, and Berkeley is right next to San Francisco. And it turns out that he's a homosexual as well. Now, this was not known until James Miller wrote his biography of Foucault. And so Foucault is spending the day preaching his brand of revolutionary ideology at Berkeley, and then at night he goes to the bathhouses of San Francisco, where he engages in sadomasochistic sex. So the interesting thing here is that basically you've got a guy who can do whatever he wants, okay? And so he engages in all of his homosexual desires. And so what he really wants now is to be punished. And he's even written a book on it about the state punishing deviants. And servir et punir. And with this book, he becomes the top philosopher of the West. And this also at this time, a little bit later, by the 1980s, the CIA gets involved and they start reading Foucault. So everybody's reading Foucault, and at this point, he becomes the official philosopher of the United States of America through Berkeley. And he goes, as I said, he's in the bathhouses of San Francisco. He and two of his homosexual friends go to Death Valley, and which had become famous by a film by Antonioni called Zabriskie Point. So they go to Zabriskie Point in Death Valley, appropriately named Death Valley, and take LSD, and he has this epiphany. He suddenly has this, he calls it his pact with the devil being the state that he's trying to overthrow. And the pact with the devil is basically the pact that he imposed on the left, or the left imposed on him, or he imposed on the left, or the left imposed on itself. And it's basically, if you give us unlimited sexual liberation, we won't criticize your economic system. And that is the new left. That is the system that has been in place to this day. And so there are all kinds of manifestations of it, but I gave this talk in Berlin a few years back. And Berlin is like the classic example of implementing Foucault's pact with the devil. Berlin had the first gay mayor in Europe, I believe, Klaus Wowereit. And Klaus Wowereit's famous slogan was, "Wir sind arm, aber sexy." We're poor, but we're sexy. Yeah. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's Foucault's pact with the devil. In other words, give us unlimited sexual liberation, and we won't criticize your economic system. Or to talk about Berlin, Berlin is now the so-called startup capital. What's the German word for startup? It's startup, typically German. They take these words. And now Berlin officially has this policy of fostering narcissism in young people by leading them to believe that they are all going to be the next Steve Jobs. And all they have to do is come to Berlin and let those ideas germinate, and boom, they're all going to be geniuses. Well, it doesn't work that way. And then Spiegel, which is one of the official organs of permitted thought in Germany, the socialist angle of it, did an article on it, and they said, wait a minute, the people quote all these people saying startups are a complete illusion. What we're really talking about is the abolition of decent wages.
Right, yeah.
Well, that's where you see where this whole kind of narcissism comes together. And so, okay, we love homosexuals because they don't get married, because they engage in transient sterile relationships, because they're all narcissists, and because they're all easy to manipulate. And that's the perfect recipe. And they all think that they're free because they can become slaves to their passions. Well, this is the whole world now. So now South Bend, Indiana, which voted for Donald Trump overwhelmingly because it used to be an industrial powerhouse and then was gutted by the leveraged buyouts of the 1980s. We have a gay mayor. It just shows you how progressive we are here. Now, this guy lied to the entire populace of South Bend, Indiana, when he ran for election the first time. Didn't tell anybody he was a homosexual, just talked about being the local hometown boy who went to St. Joe High School and had come back to town, and he got elected with a really small margin of votes. And he's imposing the same system on South Bend. So now his great achievement is putting colored lights under the bridges. Mm-hmm. So it's like the gay disco. South Bend is now the gay disco. The other thing we have under bridges is homeless people. So it's a combination. That's kind of says the whole thing about South Bend. You know, it's the gay disco with homeless people living under the bridge, because nothing has changed with the economy, but we have all this cosmetic changes. And now this weekend, now that we are here, this historic moment in South Bend, the mayor is going to marry his boyfriend. And it's going to be a big public event, and there's a big gay pride celebration here now, because South Bend has now been colonized by the oligarchs. And this man, the mayor, is a stooge of the oligarchs. Okay? Yeah. So this system is worldwide. London, I'm sure, is no different. It's all the same system all over the world. And we have Michel Foucault to thank for it.
Just to go back to that 68 revolution, if you actually look at the genesis of it, it starts with Daniel Cohn-Bendit agitating because I think it's the Sorbonne University won't have mixed-sex accommodation. So its very kind of beginnings are the sexual revolution. And I think that film, the Baader-Meinhoff complex, captures that sort of hinge moment perfectly, because they have a scene where they're training with the Palestinians, the Germans, and they are sort of nude sunbathing, and it really riles up the Palestinians. And Baader says something like sexual liberation and anti-imperialism go together, hand in glove. And
yeah, this is ridiculous. This is completely ridiculous. First of all, to get back to the revolution in France, the story is that they actually threw copies of Wilhelm Reich's book, The Psychology of Mass Fascism, at the cops. They used Wilhelm Reich is the father of sexual revolution. He's the guy who invented sexual revolution, the term. He wrote a book called Sexual Revolution. He was the man who brought Marx and Freud together, because he was a Marxist and a Freudian. He is the man who is the creator of the whole principle of sexual liberation and political control. I cover this in my book, Libido Dominandi. He's not the first to do it. The first man to do it was the Marquis de Sade at the French Revolution. But this is the man who was the patron saint of the 68 revolution. His book was used as a weapon. Yep. So, and bringing up the Palestinians here, okay, there was an alliance, de facto alliance, between the Baader-Meinhoff gang and the Palestinians, El Fatah at the time. And they collaborated in the hijacking of the Landeshut Lufthansa airplane, which was supposed to spring the Baader-Meinhoff gang from prison. Yep. And the Germans showed up and they killed everyone, all of the hijackers. And so Baader and Meinhof and Enslin were not released from prison. And once that happened, they executed Hans-Martin Schleyer, who had been being held as a hostage. So it got real ugly at this point. It got real ugly. Yep. But the other point, I mean, to get back to this alliance between the Palestinians and the left, the Baader-Meinhof gang, Foucault is waiting for the revolution, and suddenly the revolution happens in Iran. The Ayatollah Khomeini comes back from France. The Shah leaves, and there's an Islamic revolution, and Michel Foucault shows up thinking it's going to be this orgy of sadomasochism, you know, orchestrated by the Marquis de Sade and Nietzsche and all this other type of stuff, and it turns out it's the exact opposite. And he's completely out of tune with what is happening. He was there. You can see pictures of him marching around in Tehran at the time of the revolution, completely misreading the event, because this was a reaction. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a reaction to sexual liberation. Yep. The Iranians had had enough with these soft-core Italian porno films that had been flooding into Iran under the Shah during the course of the 1970s, the whole course of it. And they were scandalized because Iran continued to be a traditional culture. So they expressed their unhappiness during the revolution by burning down movie theaters and birth control clinics. So Michel Foucault completely misread the Islamic Revolution in Iran.
And how much does this whole dynamic go back to the Frankfurt School cultural Marxism, the substitution of the proletariat as the oppressed class for women, for ethnic minorities, for gays, the sort of inversion of what Marxism is?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what it is, because the oligarchs took over the left. Do you think you could really be a threat to the oligarchs when Berkeley hires you?
Yeah.
No. I mean, you're part of the establishment. You're part of the educational establishment, and the whole point of protest at Berkeley, the free speech movement during the early 1960s with Mario Savio in 1964, was that education had become a form of social engineering. They didn't like it. The students didn't like it. Mm-hmm. There's a documentary called Berkeley in the 60s. And I saw it before YouTube, but I'm sure it's on YouTube now. And the beginning of it, they talk about the free speech movement at Berkeley. And it's all of these guys, with short hair and wearing, button-down shirts. And they're all quoting Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Aquinas. By the end, they interview the same people. They all got long hair. They're all 60 years old now, and they're all talking about what great sex they had and what great drugs they took during the 1960s. Well, wait a minute, fellas. That wasn't your original intention. If you go back and look at your own videos, you're talking about something completely different. And I think what happened here is that the CIA got involved with a movement, a way to destroy this grassroots movement. And the vehicle, what they used was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yeah. And that all came together with the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
The Grateful Dead had a guy by the name of Owsley working for them. The Grateful Dead was basically a distribution network for LSD. Mm-hmm. And LSD had the same effect as pornography, as sex, and as music. In other words, it deranged you and had you focus inward. And you were looking at all of these psychedelic colors and talking about these psychedelic colors in these cool songs that you were writing. And suddenly the whole you shifted away from being a protest movement.
Yep. That's
what happened over this period of time. And we know the CIA was involved in this because they had a program called MK Ultra. That's where this all came from. Mm-hmm. Timothy Leary is a crucial figure in this regard, because he was working under MK Ultra when he was a professor at Harvard. And then depending on which Timothy Leary you talk to, he was either the rebel who, like the Prometheus, who stole this fire and tried to bring it to the people, or he was working for the CIA. He ended up saying at the end of his life that he never stopped working for the CIA.
Right, that's it, once they've got you.
Yeah, it's like the mafia. You don't retire from the CIA. I hope Phil Giraldi is exception because he was in Tehran with me. But basically, it looks as if they reeled Timothy Leary back in when they realized he had become the guru of the counterculture and was taking that in a direction that the oligarchs thought was congenial.
Right.
That's what happened.
And you see in our own time now this push for the legalization of marijuana. Is that just another oligarchic attempt to keep the population distracted, docile, easy to control?
Of course it is. Of course it is.
Yep.
You got a docile population who are just stoned.
Yep.
Believe me, I was there when the shift took place in music from alcohol to marijuana. And when you drank alcohol, you felt like dancing. Mm-hmm. And when you smoked marijuana, you felt like staring at the wall.
Yeah.
And the music started to reflect this.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of. There's a movie, a really funny movie called The In Crowd, 1980. It's about Philadelphia, which is where I grew up. I knew the whole story. It's about Philadelphia and Wildwood, which is the resort town near Philadelphia on the Jersey Shore. I met my wife on the beach in Wildwood, New Jersey in 1965.
Right.
Okay, so I know this story inside out, and it was local music, basically doo-wop music. Okay, and there was a guy, disc jockey Jerry Blavitt, who ran this scene, and then suddenly someone came in and co-opted this whole thing. It was Dick Clark, who did American Bandstand and hated Dick Clark, and so on and so forth. But the real story, the center of the story, is about this Jewish guy who was watching Bandstand and watching all these Catholic chicks dancing, you know, and these Catholic chicks were really good dancers, and the Jews didn't know how to dance at all. And so he finally fantasizes, and he ends up...
God, it sounds Philip Roth.
He goes on, and his fantasy is true. He actually gets on Bandstand, actually dances with this shiksa from Cardinal Doherty High School, and then he falls in love with her, he takes her home to the family, and the Jews don't like her because they think she's stupid, so the whole thing breaks up. So he's sad now. He's got a Jewish girlfriend. The Jewish girlfriend, so he turns on the TV, he wants to watch Bandstand again, and it's not on.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. No more dance shows, and it turns out there's a show called Hootenanny, which is a folk music show, and then his Jewish girlfriend shows up with looking like the hippie chick, and she shows him a Bob Dylan album. This was the transformation that took place during my lifetime, and it corresponded to the difference between alcohol and alcohol and marijuana, and the use of marijuana as a form of controlling a protest movement. That's what happened during this period of time, and the same thing happened in Europe 10 years later.
Yep. Yeah, it's always just that much further down the tracks for us. And you look at Berlin now, just going back to that, and its positioning as this decadent capital. It's just like history repeating itself with Weimar Germany and the decadence of Berlin then. And during the 1930s and 20s and 30s, you had was it the Human Sex Institute? All these kind of weird, degenerate institutions which were involved with social engineering. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was Magnus Hirschfeld.
Yeah.
He was like the classic Jew of the Weimar period. He created this Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, the Institute for Sexual Research, and he attracted homosexuals from all over Europe and famous homosexuals like Christopher Isherwood from England. He shows up in Berlin because it's full of this permissive homosexual culture. He ends up at the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, and it's in Goodbye to Berlin, or his memoir. I think it's in his memoir. But anyways, wait a minute. This isn't science. This is all just it's a homosexual bordello. That's what it is. It's just a front for sexual sex.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Magnus Hirschfeld was. He was the first one. He was basically the father of the gay rights movement. He started it in Germany, where all of these movements started. And if he didn't exist, Hitler would have had to invent him. I mean, this was Hitler's dream come true. And this is how Hitler's campaign against the Jews during the era of the Weimar Republic, this is how it got credibility, because the Jews were up their eyeballs in subverting the social order in Germany. The main vehicle for this was Bolshevism, which every single German knew was a Jewish movement. And one of the people who knew that firsthand was Eugenio Pacelli, who was the nuncio to Germany at that time, right after World War I. And he showed up at the Wittelsbach Palace right during the time of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. And he walked in to the Wittelsbach Palace, and he says, these aren't Germans, they're all Russian Jews. Eugen Levine, they're all Russian Jews, and they've taken over Germany. And he writes this in a report. And then our good friend Daniel Goldhagen takes this message to the nuncio, deliberately mistranslated, and tries to paint Pacelli, who became Pius XII, as an anti-Semite. Well, wait a minute. This is a diplomat. He's going into the new government, and he's got to write a report, and it's significant that the significant fact is that there are no Germans running this government. It's all a foreign occupation led by Russian Jews. This is what put the wind into Hitler's sails. because he could say this, it was true, and even the Roman Catholic Church knew it was true, and everybody knew it was true, and they decided to do something about it.
And concurrently, at the same time in Bolshevik Russia, you had, what was probably one of the first sexual revolutions of the 20th century, and it led to so much social breakdown that they actually rode back on it, and they made abortion illegal. And Stalin, he completely, he just completely reversed it.
That's right. Stalin, in order to stop, you introduce sexual revolution, it will destroy your culture. Right. And Stalin understood this, and so there was a battle between the nationalists and the Jewish internationalists. So it came down to a battle between Stalin and Trotsky. But you're right, the initial phase of the Russian Revolution was basically sexual revolution. And the lady who was famous for promoting this was Alexandra Kollontai, who said that was famous for saying that having sex was just like having a drink of water. Oh, yeah. Well, they were drinking a lot of water in the Soviet Union at this time, and it was spreading chaos, and basically Stalin had the showdown, drove Trotsky from the country, and established his own kind of national socialism, and in the same way that Hitler was trying to do, and basically had to put an end to it. So you had the irony here is, of course, that in 1928, Wilhelm Reich shows up in the Soviet Union, and he's the apostle of masturbation. That's what Wilhelm Reich stands for, is masturbation. And the Russians are appalled. Who is this guy, and what does he think he's doing? So Reich was completely out of sync with what happened in Russia. Tried to promote it, but they understood that how destructive it was, and it was over by that point. And Stalin was in control.
And to take this back to our current day, I think if you look at the symbol of sodomy pride now, the rainbow flag, I don't think that it's a coincidence that that symbol is the same symbol as the sign of the covenant God gave to Noah, and he said, "Go forth and multiply," and we're embracing that symbol at the very same time that we completely turn our back on that commandment from God to go forth and multiply, and we all, to an extent, become homosexuals. I mean, in my mind, that's not a coincidence. It has the fingerprints of the diabolical all over it.
The inversion, the diabolical inversion.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the man who's responsible for this is Jesse Jackson, because when Jesse Jackson ran for president, he called his group the Rainbow Coalition. Yeah. Now, whether Jesse Jackson had Noah in mind is something I don't know, but I think that's where it came from. But you're talking about basically the co-optation of a liberation movement in the United States, the civil rights movement. So over this period of time, the civil rights movement became the feminist movement, and the feminist movement became the homosexual movement, and they're trying to move it into something even more bizarre now, which nobody understands what a transgendered person is. Yeah. But apparently that's the direction it's heading now.
Well, there's the sin of sodomy in the particular sense, so homosexual activity, but then there's also the general sense, which is sexual activity outside marriage that isn't open to life. And right. And Charlie Rice talks about how that we're all becoming homosexualized by embracing contraception. And if you look at, in this country, we had, can you believe it, a conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, who foisted gay marriage on us. And all these so-called conservatives made this argument that, this kind of dog whistle argument that, look, homosexuals, they're pretty socially disruptive, but we can kind of domesticate them by bringing them into this institution of marriage, and they end in effect sort of heterosexualize the homosexuals. But in fact, the reverse has happened. The heterosexuals have become homosexualized. So you've now got all these sort of think pieces kind of testing the water, saying, oh, heterosexuals should learn from homosexuals and have open relationships and polyamorous relationships and not take all these things too seriously. And just going back to that woman you mentioned, sex is just like having a glass of water. It doesn't matter what kind of receptacle the water's in. Just swap it all around.
Yeah.
That's where it's going next, I think.
I think you're right. I think, well, this was the intention from the beginning among the homosexuals. There was a book that came out in the 80s called something like How the Homosexual Movement is Going to Change the United States of America. And it said basically there that everyone will become a homosexual. And of course, they echoed, they didn't quote Charlie Rice, but they echoed his point, which is basically once you use contraception to disconnect the sexual act from procreation, there's no way to prevent the trajectory from ending up with homosexuality.
Right.
Homosexuality, once you do make that disconnection, homosexuality is the logical conclusion. And so therefore it shouldn't be surprising that everyone is now supposed to act like a homosexual.
Yep.
I did a piece on the Cincinnati Ballet because my son and his wife were dancing for the Cincinnati Ballet. And I said basically that by the time they arrived in Cincinnati to dance, which was like the first decade of this century, that was normative. In other words, everyone was there to engage in transient sterile relationships. So you could,
like
you pick apart. Yeah, they're like universities. Ballet used to be the avant-garde of sexual deviance, but homosexuals don't need cover anymore. So they've adopted basically, so everybody's a homosexual. And everyone, the young ladies in particular, just found this intolerable because they would be dancing longer and longer, and suddenly they wake up and they realize, I dedicated my entire life to a ballet. I can't have children. My life is over, that part of my life, and I'm unhappy.
Yep.
And so everybody's doing the sex robot dance, which is what modern dance is, and as an expression of this unhappiness,
Yep.
But it with the transformation, Cincinnati was in many ways crucial in this transformation because that's where the Mapplethorpe photography was exhibited as a way of basically breaking down the stigma of homosexuality. Mapplethorpe's photography was crucial in this regard. He was the man on the scene because before Mapplethorpe, everybody thought homosexuals were kind of, they're just not pleasant people. When I was, younger, you were hitchhiking around, they'd pick you up at night and proposition you, these sleazy old guys. So Mapplethorpe changed that by making them into something heroic through his photography. And that was part of the transformation. So what happened at the ballet was basically there was a protest, a kind of inchoate protest, where 4 ballerinas got pregnant all around the same time, all in protest against this whole thing. And then 40% of the company left because it just become intolerable. This is the type of protest that is suppressed. No one talks about it, but that generation of people is very unhappy.
Well, this is where it's also twisted because the propaganda to bring this about is all about love. They have these kind of so-called gay families, and they're no different to us. But the reality of homosexuality is sort of hidden away. I remember seeing a scientific study, that most people's saliva response, which is a sort of physiological response as disgust, was the same when they saw a picture of 2 men kissing as a bucket of maggots. So that nature is always there, but it's a bit like abortion. The sin is kind of disguised and sort of furtively kept to one side and broadcast as something else.
Yeah, well, you have every Hollywood sitcom on television. The only people who can get along with each other are the homosexual couples. The heterosexual married couples are always fighting, but they're portrayed as some type of idealized. Well, they are the ideal. I've already given a talk called "The Homosexual is the Ideal Citizen," and so one man who took account of this was Joe Biden. Vice President Biden, after the Obergefell decision legalizing gay marriage, said that Hollywood was responsible. And then he went on to say even worse than that. He mentioned Will and Grace and sitcoms like that. And then he went on to say, if it weren't for the Jews, we wouldn't have gay marriage. Well, this caused a lot of embarrassment among a certain group of people because he spilled the beans. He shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
But then Amy Dean said the same thing in Tikkun magazine. And nobody was embarrassed by that time when she said that. So, yeah, what you had was a long cultural preparation for this moment and Hollywood was heavily involved in it.
I've just finished your book, Degenerate Moderns. Great book and very prescient to what we've been talking about. I just want to read a quotation, okay? It's actually not from yourself, it's from George Steiner, okay? So this guy's a Jewish literary critic, and he said something that, it's one of those sentences, I almost fell off my chair when I read it, okay? So he says, Judaism and homosexuality, most intensely where they overlap, as in a Proust or a Wittgenstein, are the two main generators of the entire fabric and savour of urban modernity in the West. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big statement. That's a big statement. But you go on to talk about, you know, how in a sense we're living under homosexual economics with John Maynard Keynes, and this, you know, this piling up of debts bespeaks a childless vision of the future.
Yes, we live in the ninth circle of hell.
Yeah.
Dante put sodomites and usurers in the ninth circle of hell. Because the sodomite takes what is fertile, namely sex, and makes it sterile, and the usurer takes what is sterile, namely money, and makes it fertile through compound interest. So there's something really archetypal about this confluence. I mean, if Dante can talk about it in the 13th century, when it really was, I mean, it was an issue in Florence. There's no question about sodomy and usury were issues in Florence at this time under the Medici. Right. But it's also a kind of natural trajectory. Mm-hmm. If you go bad, if the society really goes bad and goes to hell in a handbasket, you're going to end up with sodomy and usury. That's the end station, and that's where we are. That's where we are in our culture.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so if the idea that this philosophy, this anti-philosophy that governs the modern world has its roots in Judaism, then it has its roots in the Talmud, and that's a work that I've looked at. First, it manifests itself in the sort of anti-logos.
Well, it is the gospel of anti-logos.
Right.
So So the Talmud is the oral tradition that got written down over the period of 600 years after the death of Christ. So this is basically this is the crisis I describe in my book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, where the Messiah comes and the Jews have free will, and they decide, are we going to accept him or not? And they reject him. The Jews are the people that killed Christ, and they are become, as a result, enemies of the entire human race. Because that's St. Paul, by the way, and because they rejected the Logos incarnate. But when you're rejecting the Logos in general as well, which means the order that God created for the universe.
Yep.
Well, what is the essence? The essence of the rejection of that order, it's sodomy, because you're rejecting nature. And I think that quote that you just read is in the chapter on Anthony Blunt, I believe.
Right. Yeah, it is.
Which was one of the Cambridge traders, and they were all homosexuals. And so the classic guy, I quote E.M. Forster's novel Morris a lot in that book, because he was a very articulate guy, part of the Bloomsbury crowd, who wrote about homosexuality from the inside. They understood, since you're in rebellion against the Victorian generation in England, and you're in rebellion in general. Well, the essence of rebellion is sodomy, because you're rebelling against nature. You're rebelling against the order of nature in the most intimate fashion. And so Lytton Strachey and he referred to Bloomsbury as the higher sodomy.
Right. Yep.
Higher sodomy. That's what that prepared them to become traitors, because they all became communists during the 1930s. They were aesthetes during the 1920s, and they were communists during the 1930s, and they ended up working for the Soviet Union, betraying Britain to its enemies. Yeah. But that's the end station. And usury, as I said, is related. Dante saw the relation, because that's the end station for your economy.
Right.
Because what you institute,
both the sort of anti-realist at their core.
Yes.
Anti-reality.
Yes, because there is no such thing. Money cannot copulate. That's what Aquinas said. He was basing it on Aristotle. He said if you put 2 coins in a drawer and you come back 6 weeks later, you're still going to just have 2 coins. Mm-hmm. You put 2 mice in the drawer, you'll have a lot of mice all over the place. Yep. Money cannot copulate. Money is sterile. And sterility is the essence of homosexuality. It's the negation of sex. Yep. And so it should come as no surprise that this is the rule of our culture. It's sodomy and usury. Lloyd Blankfein, head of Goldman Sachs, is a proponent of gay marriage. Mm-hmm. It's not surprising.
I know your expertise is as a cultural historian, literature reviewer, but if you look at the Catechism, it says there are several marks of the end times, and one of them is this falling away, so the faith would spread to all corners of the world. And then there'd be a falling away from the faith, and then there'd be the arrival of the Antichrist. Well, it seems like we're kind of getting towards the end of stage 2.
Does seem that way, doesn't it? I just got back from another trip to Iran, and I was struck by the mullahs. Every time a mullah got up and talked, he was talking about the return of the 12th Imam, which is part of Shia Islam. The Imam. The 12th Imam has been in a state of occultation. He's been hidden. He didn't die. He's been hidden for 1,000 years now. But they're all talking, and whenever they would say it, they would say, Jesus and the 12th Imam are going to return.
Right. Interesting.
Because they kept putting Jesus first.
Yeah.
Maybe because it was an audience from the West mostly, but they kept saying Jesus and the 12th Imam are going to return. They had this sense of the end times. You just got that sense from them that they're talking about the end times.
Yeah, and if you listen quite carefully to the sort of homilies of Benedict XVI, he seems to invoke this. Looking around at the world, he knows what's going on, and he talks about being ready for the end of the world and the falling away of the faith. And if you listen to Our Lady's various apparitions, whether you believe them or not, but she talks about the sort of mass apostasy of the Catholic Church. Is that going on with Francis? His attempts to kind of get rid of teaching on marriage, the idea of objective truth. Seem a lot of things sort of coalescing at the moment.
Well, look at the referendum in Ireland.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just 30 years, the decline in the faith in Ireland over this 30 years. It was in the 1980s that they put the Eighth Amendment in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was in the 1980s when I believe it was 1/3 of the population showed up in Phoenix Park to attend Mass said by Pope John Paul II.
I think
something. What happened during that time? What happened? I gave a talk. It's on YouTube now of a talk I gave in Dublin. Yeah. It was 8 years ago. I gave this talk in Dublin, and I tried to explain how the pedophile crisis, how this priest crisis was being weaponized to destroy Irish culture. And I said 8 years ago that it's being used to introduce usury. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This was actually I quoted Mary Kenny, who said the same thing.
Yeah.
She said that basically this attack on the church was to soften it up for the introduction of usury. And what happened after that time, they had the financial crash, and the Irish, the stupid Irish, decided to make the bankers whole. They're going to pay off those ridiculous debts. Iceland did the exact opposite. Yeah. And Iceland was going to be forever exiled from international credit. Well, that's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. You have to stiff the bankers. The Icelanders were smart. The Irish were stupid. And you make that move, and now you've completely, over this period of time, you've subjugated yourself.
Yep.
It's not after what the British couldn't do to the Irish over centuries, the Irish have done to themselves in a period of 30 short years.
Yeah. I think
I say the same thing about Australia. They had a referendum approving gay marriage. I said, first of all, the United States has never approved these things. Both gay marriage and abortion were imposed on the United States by the oligarchs through the Supreme Court. So I said, what you have in Australia is a neo-penal colony.
Yeah.
I mean, you're an Australian because your grandfather stole Trevelyan's corn, and they put you on a prison ship and they shipped you off to Botany Bay. But you knew why you were there. Your grandfather knew why he was there. It was economic injustice. Well, now you're a neo-penal colony because what you do is you lock yourself in your cell every night. Your grandfather never did that.
Yeah. I think most analysis of the Irish referendum missed the mark because they all kind of blamed the clerical sex abuse crisis, which obviously played a part. But I think more important was what happened in the 90s. Ireland was globalized. And you wrote something in the 90s, I think, or you said something, and it sort of pertains to what happened in Ireland. Once again, the church, the body of Christ, is crucified between two thieves. Free markets and free sex. Yeah. And that's all that's happened in Ireland. It's that global monoculture has flooded the place, and it's sexual liberation is a key component of that. But I'm still absolutely shocked at the margin of victory. I mean, it's one thing in the 60s when we didn't have the science about abortion, the ultrasound, that kind of thing. People were kind of naive about it. That doesn't exist anymore. Everyone knows that you legalize abortion for the so-called hard cases. You're going to have abortion on demand. There's going to be thousands and thousands of murdered babies. Everyone's seen the pictures, that must move you in some way of a sort of mutilated baby. I mean, how you can actually go in there and actually tick yes to removing the right to the unborn child, I do not know. No, because they know. Yeah. I mean, 1973, in the United States, we woke up one day and suddenly the Supreme Court had overturned every state law on abortion. And I think there were people there who didn't know. I think I was one of them. If you want my honest opinion, I think I was one of them. Yeah. Because I was in graduate school at the time. I heard about abortion, didn't know really what it was. I had a child at that time. I know that people were talking about abortion when my wife was pregnant. I just found the whole thing so repugnant I wouldn't even think about it. And I was hardly a saint at this time. And then I left the country. So I left the country in June, not really understanding what it meant. Well, you can't say that about the Irish. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is horrendous in terms of the culpability that these people must have for choosing something like this. Goes back to Civiltà Cattolica and the series on the Jewish question with Civiltà Cattolica, which is the official magazine of the Vatican, published in 1890. And they said, you talked about that George Steiner quote. Well, there's a similar quote in there for me, from my point of view. And it said, any country that turns away from the rules, the laws made by Christian rulers will end up being ruled by Jews. Yeah. And they were talking about France. And this was on the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. And basically what the French Revolution created was Jewish power. And the Rothschilds ruling Europe. That's what they created. And now you're going to see something similar in Ireland. It's going to be the rule of usury because you folks turned away from the law, that Catholic-inspired law of the 1980s to protect the unborn. Yeah, and what you said before, what's so sad is that the Catholic Church was in many ways the vessel in which Irish identity survived, like Poland, hundreds of years of foreign occupation. Right. So it really is the end of Ireland at the same time as well. God have mercy on us. Yes. Yes. The mysterious figure here is Diarmuid Martin. Yeah. I knew him when he was the secretary to Cardinal Gagnon at the Pontifical Council on the Family in Rome. He was a staunch supporter of all of these things, and now he's suddenly gone silent. Yeah. The church he wouldn't make a statement on gay marriage, on the gay marriage referendum. He said he just didn't want to say one way or the other. He did afterwards, saying he understood why it was a big moment for Ireland's LGBT population. Yeah, and then it's even gotten worse. Now he hopes that abortion will be safe and rare in Ireland. It's unbelievable.
Clinton said. Wait a minute, are you channeling Hillary Clinton now?
Yeah.
What happened here? This is the primate of Ireland, and he's talking, sounded like Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jones. That was fascinating as ever, and I will. I'll send you the link for that as well, so you can put it up. I think it works quite well